Welcome to Untethered to Rooted, a podcast that brings you a collection of stories around grief, healing, and identity. Hear from everyday people how grief and loss shape their identity and how their identity shapes the way they heal and process grief. I'm your host, Daugherty, a licensed psychotherapist with extensive experience dealing with grief, both personally and professionally. And if you want to hear stories with gems and practical tools for healing, stay tuned for more. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Untethered to Rooted. Today, we'll be discussing grief, healing, and identity as related to Jessica's story around finding something worth living for and finding that at a young age that life was really difficult. At home, Jessica had lived through abuse and neglect, leading her to feel like she no longer wanted to live. And in her desperate search for truth to survive, to find something worth living for, she found politics and later on found faith and spirituality. Through political re-education and a search for improved mental health, politics really gave her meaning when she felt like things felt worthless and meaningful. She went through ups and downs in the mental health system and mental health misdiagnosis and medical negligence as a child. And Jessica thought, if I could spend my life helping people, then maybe my life could be worth living. And she really wanted to be part of a society that could actually self-actualize. And so, healing the world, she realized, was her passion, and also she realized it was a surrogate for healing her own family situation as well. So, by way of introduction, I'm introducing Jessica's son, pronouns she, they. She is a second-generation Chinese U.S.ian from Virginia with a passion for community organizing. An adult convert to Christianity, she is an experienced local volunteer community advocate. Christians for a Free Palestine and Pax Christi USA are her organizing homes, and she is currently in the application process with the Sisters of Providence of St. Mary of the Woods. Prior to her religious formation, she was a full-time software engineer for 5 years as a computer science graduate from the Virginia Tech College of Engineering. And she's also super passionate about ethics and technology. So, Jessica, I just want to say welcome. Thanks for being here.
Oh, good to be here, Dana. Thank you for creating this space.
Yeah, I know, absolutely. Yeah, and so I ask all of my guests this. I usually like for people to socially and positionality-wise locate themselves. So I wonder for you, if you'd be willing to share, what are some of your identities that are important to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate that. First, I am a second generation Chinese American. That means my parents immigrated. My dad's from Hong Kong, my mom from Guangzhou, and I was born here. So growing up Chinese in Northern Virginia in the 90s was an experience. My sister and I often joke about what if we grew up on the West Coast where there was a lot of Asian representation. As kids, we were the first non-white family to move into an all-white neighborhood. We had fruit thrown at us when we were riding our bikes around school. And when I was in kindergarten, my mom needed to get a restraining order from a fellow boy on the kindergarten bus for continuing to pull my hair and call me a chink. So that was definitely a formative part of childhood too.
Yeah. Wow. What, terrible experience to have that happen to you as a child, but also, what an experience also in the 90s to experience all of that and also realize just being othered, even at a very young age, I'm hearing.
Right. I am not the majority. I am not represented. I am in the margin, and I knew that early on. Later on in life, I came out. I identify as pansexual myself. I use she, they pronouns. I also identify as a non-binary woman, which may sound like a paradox or a contradiction, but I think sometimes the queer community can get too boxed in on labels itself, but it works for me, it feels right for me, and that's what I like to say. That is another identity that I prescribe to.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that too. Yeah, it's important to just see and hear where you socially locate yourself and qualify that too. Ooh, well, there's so much to get into, especially with your bio and this topic of just grief, healing, and identity is related to politics and mental health and contemplative activism. Curious, from everything I shared about your bio and, you know, what you grew up with, obviously injustice and hate, very early experiences. What's your connection to this topic today, and how is grief even relevant to this?
Well, I guess I'll start from the beginning, right?
Yeah.
As I think is so crucial for everybody. When it comes to any kind of vocation, I love when spiritual directors start with, how was your childhood? What was your relationship with your dad like? What about your mom? Did you have siblings? And it's like, oh no, how is this relevant to me wanting to, explore this kind of vocation? But it all starts there. It all starts at home. And as a therapist, I think you know that more than most. So for me, we grew up in an abusive childhood. It was, there's a lot of neglect, there's a lot of physical abuse, a lot of emotional abuse. In my household, I have a younger brother of 2 years and an older sister of 2 years. I am a zillennial, so I'm 29, right at the oldest Gen Z and youngest millennial. That's where I am. But three of us are pitted against one another. My dad wasn't really part of the picture. My mom really sees us each as extensions of herself, And I'm able to say these things now because I've had a lot of therapy. Thank God for therapy, the greatest privilege of my life. So I'll continue to be grateful for that. And from that childhood, by the time I was 12, I was convinced that life was no longer worth living. My dad was Catholic, but he wasn't part of our childhoods, didn't really raise us. My mom was atheist, and she raised us, and she taught us that religion is for dumb people. And the religious people I saw around me growing up at the time were very bigoted. They, hated queer people. My little brother is gay as well. That has never been accepted. They also did not welcome immigrants as immigrants themselves, and I couldn't square this hypocrisy with what I perceived to be the teachings of Jesus then. So I really judged religion by its hypocrites and formally became atheist around that time. So even in all of the despair and pressures of growing up in a stressful academic environment, and dealing with a lot of situations you can't escape from and can't run from as a helpless child, and needing to make your parents to be good figures, right? Because a childhood where the parents are bad is intolerable to most children, and we make up something to blame ourselves, right? So it was then that I, just in case somebody was right and there was life after this life, and I needed to find the truth. And it was a real fear-fueled, despair-fueled search for truth and for meaning and purpose. And so that's what really kicked that off. So when it comes to grief and worth, I think that was a starting point there. And for me, when I was in high school, there was an upperclassman who died by suicide, and that really kicked off some level of, I think, permission to really get involved in mental health activism. I grew up in an apolitical, conservative-leaning household. There's this Chinese proverb that says, "The nail that sticks up gets hammered down."
Wow.
And I hear that there are similar proverbs in many other cultures as well.
It's
but
so
we
visual.
were not allowed. Right?
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Like, what is your role, right? What are you allowed to do? And so even getting into mental health activism was a big piece for me, and I kind of started finding my way there. So that was a start, I guess, for childhood, and then that eventually led into activism and politics as I was grappling with this severe depression and a mental health misdiagnosis. Where should I go from here?
Yeah. Well, I maybe pause for a second. I just have so many questions about you're obviously experienced so much pushback on your identity as a child, and also it's just so present that I'm curious to know, like, growing up in an apolitical household, also like atheist household, there's no belief system or like whether it's politics or whether it's faith. So I'm wondering what that was like. Did that just feel normal to just not have a belief system around you? Was it normal to just, especially in terms of politics, like if I'm apolitical, then it's like, what does that mean in terms of how you respond to events around you and people around you who are also really bigoted?
Yeah, that's a huge question, right? I love in many different songs and many different verses are that saying, we're all a slave to something, just figuring out what you're a slave to. Growing up, it was definitely money. That was what drew my parents. And then this messaging I received very early, and it's very common with a lot of kids, especially kids of immigrants, that you have to make money for me. It's your turn. Growing up low income,
Mm.
right? And so my only purpose in life was to make enough money for my parents' retirement. That was it. There was nothing about
Oh.
my dreams, nothing about my concerns, nothing about my hopes that mattered. That was the only thing that mattered. My sister and I today have built the first secure relationship in our family, and that's like the proudest accomplishment of my life. But I love the way she says it, and she's now a third year resident in psychiatry, is that my mom lives in a state of psychological lack that she tries to fill with money, but it's never enough money. So if there was a religion or belief system in our household, that was it.
Wow. That there's never that like money is what allows you to live and thrive, and that your purpose as a child is to secure enough money for me to continue living once I'm done making money. Is that right?
Exactly.
Wow. Wow. That sounds like a lot of pressure, actually, as like a 12-year-old who's not making money, right? But then if you're like nurtured into that thought system, right, then it's a lot of like, I imagine like duty to capitalism and financial things, a lot of those types of belief systems, all right?
Exactly. And so even deciding that later on that, software engineering, it's good for I'm good enough at it. I think it's interesting, but oh my gosh, there's no meaning here. And wanting to pivot from that, eventually go into politics, felt like betraying my family for the understanding that I was where I was of my family then. It was a
Mm.
long, long journey, let
Ah.
alone becoming a sister now. Oh my goodness. Voluntary poverty, what is that? Every immigrant parent screams.
You know, I, I don't know if it's the same, but maybe I know like you are chocked with really good quotes but I often find sometimes, at least in my work, that sometimes kids do the things that are just like what parents would call rebellious, but what kids are doing is like the opposite of the things that their parents are like restraining them from doing. It actually kind of sparks a kid's curiosity to do more of those things. So it's
Right.
just interesting. It's like growing up in a household where it's apolitical and atheist, and it's like, well, actually, let me then get into like something in you was like, let me like actually explore this around politics. Let me explore
Oh
faith,
yeah.
you know?
I
Yeah.
am big time questioning authority. I don't buy it. Let me throw my life wholeheartedly into this and maybe I'll find something worth able to hold me and something to worth holding on to.
Yeah. Like going back to what you were talking about, yeah, at 12, that's so hard. And I think that like kid and teenage like suicide is really like big, especially like it's not, it's all, we see it more in the news. It's not that it's like big, but we see it more now. And there's more awareness around mental health. And I'm wondering, this questioning of authority, is that in some ways something that felt protective to you, or something that kind of like what do you think the role of questioning authority had for just how you were feeling mental health wise? Yeah.
I think there's a few different places I could take this from my
Yeah.
Enneagram type to whatnot, but I really wanted to have some kind of control over my life, and I think that could
Mm.
apply to a bunch of people. I identify as Enneagram 8 for those who like to study Enneagram, and one of our big fears is being controlled by others, and so we try to control our situations, which is
Yeah.
usually fruitless and often partially self-blinded because we like to lie to ourselves about how much we depend on others, but we do, and we all need each other. So in
Mm.
high school, I was misdiagnosed with bipolar. right? My mom, I was having terrible insomnia from the absolute despair and total depression and intense anxiety. And I was taken to a mental health emergency, a regular emergency room where they transferred me to a mental health emergency room where I got diagnosed with bipolar and put on an extremely insane medication regimen. So
Mm.
my sister, now a third year resident, right, was able to confirm for me, like, this is crazy that they would start a 15-year-old girl on this combination of meds. This would not
Wow.
even be given to a 45-year-old man who was inpatient, right? So I was gained 40 pounds in like 2 months. I was sleeping like 18 hours a day. For my senior year of high school, I switched to my local high school. And through it all, my mom gained total control of my life. The way I survived that was like, wow, my mom was my savior. But she told me that I couldn't tell anybody at school what was going on, that if I told anybody, I would never get a job and I would put the family in danger. Quote unquote, putting the family in danger was a strong theme. And so I became totally robotic. And I got through high school, I got through college, and then it was actually a year or two out as a young adult with my own psychiatrist, my own therapy, and again, thank God for therapy, that another psychiatrist told me that I don't think you have bipolar. I think that, and I began to explore with my psychologist my complex PTSD diagnosis that is
Mm.
comorbid with ADHD. And so that was kind of a snippet of a long and traumatic journey for me, and losing all of my support network at school, which pretty much was my only support network because home was so abusive.
Wow. Wow. Jessica, thank you for sharing that. It's like, oh, there's so much hurt and pain and misuse of the medical system too, with like authority over you, and especially parents, like parental authority over you, and that power and control as described. I think people don't realize also like that's essentially what abuse is that power and control dynamic there. And then I imagine that receiving that new diagnosis and realizing, like this was a misdiagnosis, then maybe I don't know, how did it feel for you? Did it kind of release you of some of the things that felt like were taking, like, holding control over your life?
Yeah, my first reaction to being told, like, I think you have anxiety, right? Because complex PTSD is a form of anxiety. And I remember my first reaction to that psychiatrist was like, absolutely not. I'm so confident. What do you mean? I'm not an anxious person. I had no idea what anxiety really meant, right? But oh my
Mm,
gosh, it has freed me greatly, right? Bipolar is a real diagnosis, and I think there's plenty to say about young women and women of color in particular being misdiagnosed bipolar or
yeah,
borderline too early,
totally.
and how it failed me then. But even as how the medical and psychiatry field has changed now, I have so much hope, faith, and trust in our psychiatrists today, in the field of therapy today. What I had was definitely not a good case, but I think it was more of the exception than the norm.
Mm, yeah, yeah. I think you're right. That it does, like, misdiagnosis definitely happens, and especially with people of color, I think, and women of color especially, and how it presents. And it is like diagnosing is also sometimes is helpful for naming things for things that are like people that people need, and also sometimes it fails us because it's an imperfect naming system. So
Yeah.
yeah, and it's also doesn't, like, I think only trauma and looking at things through a trauma informed lens
Oh my
really
gosh.
wasn't, when
Yes.
you were in high school, like, wasn't even as big of a thing. I think people were just starting to like talk about being trauma informed only in like early 2000s, maybe late 1990s.
I know, right? We stand Dr. Judith Herman so much for coining
Yeah.
the term complex PTSD. I'm really
Yeah.
thankful for Stephanie Foo's What My Bones Know that almost
Mm,
single-handedly made CPTSD common
yeah.
vernacular overnight, also as a Chinese American woman, right? But
Yes.
exactly,
Yes.
like these developments are so recent, and I'm so
Mm.
grateful that the stigma around mental health and whatnot continues to erode.
Yeah, yeah. I'm wondering, just like, I think it's really important as like a second generation Chinese immigrant and also just, child of the 90s and 2000s, how have your identity sort of like shaped how you process the grief of your childhood?
Yeah, we all contain multitudes, and I can't separate out even. I know that I would not be who I am today without what I went through, which I've probably been one of the most cliche answers, but it's also about finding your people, right? Finding your community with people who get it. Dana and I met through the Pox Fellowship, right?
Yeah,
It
yeah.
stood for Emerging Christians of Color. And just being in that space was amazing, right?
Yeah,
Like a lot of
yeah.
us who are people of color in a white Western church that was not made for us. Wow, beautiful. So I think finding community is huge. So this is the mental health aspect of the track for me, and founding Active Minds at Virginia Tech was my first foray into activism as a freshman, and then a year later coming out about my bipolar diagnosis to the public, which felt at that point like betraying my family. And then the year after, really getting into politics due to a crisis of meaning, that another crisis of meaning. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Do you want to get into that?
Oh yeah. So the way big tech was heading, even in high school, I was like trying to share and shout into the void, even like, just because we can build it doesn't mean we should.
Mm.
And I think that, 10 years later, it's like, yep, that absolutely tracks. Yeah, we have done a lot of things we should not have. Um,
Yeah.
but, as they say, meaning for humankind is not a luxury, it is a necessity. And I could not find meaning in big tech. I remember there was a particular time in like my early junior year of college where I hit another like new low. Clubs, school, classes, dating, whatever, all of that was going fine, but I felt so hollow, so worthless. I felt totally meaningless. I'm like, this job is not going to help society. And I made this realization. And it felt really big at the time, and you mentioned it in the intro, but I was like, all right, Jessica, you need to survive, if not for you, then for the people who love you. And I was like, all right, even if my life is totally worthless and meaningless, not true, but that's what I thought then,
At the
then
time.
if I can spend my life helping people, then maybe my life can be worth something. And I looked hard at my own privileges and underprivileges, what I was good at and what I wasn't, what I was passionate about and what I wasn't, and the needs of the world as best I could. And my big girl answer as an agnostic in undergrad was campaign finance reform. This is it. This is how we solve the root of all issues. Is campaign finance reform.
Yeah.
So I was
Yeah.
like, I pivoted. I was like, you know what? I am going to run for office, or I'm going to get into public policy, or I'm going to get into tech public policy. And this is something where I can find meaning for myself and I can build a life worth living. And so
Wow.
my mission statement became to build a society that optimizes for the best possible opportunity of self-actualization for all. That's a society I want to be part of.
Mm.
That's a society I wanted to build. And so I began getting to know my local activists at Virginia Tech in Southwest Virginia. This was around the time of the Dakota Access Pipeline, so joining Wells Fargo protests, getting to
Oh,
learn a
yeah.
little bit about Appalachian activism. Oh my gosh, the elders in that movement and the environmental conversation and agribusiness, all that kind of stuff. Amazing people. Getting connected with young adults and liberal professors and such like that on campus too, from my only tech class load, was a big learning experience.
Hmm.
Graduating, I wanted to stay where I grew up. I believe that you can know how to make the best
Hmm.
change where you grew up, and so and having enough work-life balance to volunteer enough for politics post-graduation was all part of what I was thinking. I was trying to desperately build this meaning for myself. A few years
Wow.
later, I can look back now and also realize that when the political burnout hit, because it did, even in community with other activists, over and over and over again, part of why it felt so bad was because healing the world through politics and activism, through my elected and appointed local volunteer positions, was a surrogate problem for fixing my family. So every time I failed to heal the world, it felt like I was again failing to heal my family. And that definitely was not sustainable.
Yeah. How did you know, I have, that's a kind of a two-pronged question, but how did you know that you're experiencing burnout, political burnout? And then how did you know also that reforming campaign financing was it for you? Was that was the play? So.
Yeah, let's see. It was 2016, and growing up in a conservative apolitical household, my starting point was oh, Bernie's too extreme. So I had very, very little education at the time, right? In 2020, I would become a national delegate for the Bernie Sanders campaign in Virginia, but that was my starting point in my very first year of my political re-education. And so that was just me having a cursory understanding of just domestic news, not having connected to international struggles yet, not understanding the military-industrial complex. And actually, from the 2020 campaign is when I met my first Palestinian American activists. And that's when I began to connect domestic issues like labor and education to the broader military-industrial complex and the issue of Palestine. And when I decided to publicly align myself to the Palestinian cause, I knew at that point in 2020 that I would never win office in Virginia, starting with state delegate and that kind of stuff. And that was a compromise I never made, considering where I was going and why I was going into this, and being able to be an engineer to keep saving up for whatever future career switch.
Wow. So everything sort of started as you were hitting the pavement in 2016, 2020, really. And then I heard you mentioning Palestine. Did you learn about, when did you learn about what was happening in Palestine? When did that come up for you as well?
Yeah, that was 2020 from my fellow delegates on the campaign trail for Bernie Sanders, and I'm so grateful for them. Burnout, that was obvious to me. I could not move, right? I was just full of despair. I would take days off of work. I just would have no motivation, right? These telltale signs. And so kind of parallel to my political activism journey, my software engineer by day, activist or leftist by life that was developing here, which is also in total refusal of my role as a daughter in my family, right? All these things were total 180s from where I was supposed to go. The role I was supposed to play was my search for meaning, philosophy, purpose. And as that was happening along the way, even in secular film, art, and literature, I could gather that the greatest thing we ever learn was just to love and be loved in return. And I had been on this desperate journey to seek what it means to love. What does it really mean to love? In hopes that maybe I could learn to love myself. And so I tried all sorts of things, and it was everything but Christianity. Optimistic nihilism, Nietzsche, strains of that, Taoism was my main spiritual foray, I'd say, and New Age spirituality at tarot decks. I also I was consorting and having random beach retreats with friends who were Hindu and trying to delve into knowing. And I think even the practice of contemplation, meditation, of mindfulness, which you don't need to believe in any god to practice, was really helpful for me, along with a lot of therapy. A lot of therapy.
Yeah. Yeah. Multi-pronged approach.
For love. Yes.
Yeah. I really hear that. So as you were kind of pursuing these your political passions and search for meaning and search for truth and what is true, and also search for love, is when you were also exploring, makes sense, a lot of different belief systems that you probably weren't even introduced to as a kid because of because of just the environment that you grew up in, where it was we're not doing that. But then it really kind of sounds
religion is for dumb people.
Right, religion is for dumb people. So then naturally, as as a kid, you were
Oh
like,
no.
okay, well, let me explore that, you know? Yeah. And
Right.
yeah, yeah. Wow. And so I'm curious, like, in that search, because it sounds like a very intentional search. And so for some people, like, they might fall into a search, but yours sounds like more intentional. I'm curious, like, how, like, kind of what sparks that search? Maybe is that my question? Maybe clearly there were so many things from your childhood that sparked that search, but for some, I'm thinking of the person who isn't necessarily intentional, but still has those questions, you know? And I'm thinking of the person that's like, yeah, I don't know, like, what's true? I don't know how to, like, start searching. Like, how did you pick a pathway to, like, where you just like, let me try things. Let me do the speech retreat, like, and like the Hindu practices. Let me, like, you know,
Right. Right.
let me, like, read more about Taoism. Let me, like, do these tarot decks. Like, what was part of, was it just like, let me try different things?
I think Noam Chomsky has that amazing quote about what it means to be educated, right? And essentially, he talks about what it means to really critically think, how to know how to form questions, and I think huge in that is also self-awareness. Self-awareness and self-understanding is like, I say I'm asking this question, but am I really asking another question? Some would argue that
Ooh.
in every single thing we're saying, we're also just asking, do you love me? Right? So there's a lot of layers. You have to know yourself, and it's connecting the pieces on a bigger level. My search was spurred way too early, way too intensely, right? I would not wish my journey on anybody. All of it was desperate. It was a desperate search for meaning, right? Like, depression is not merely sadness, it's the inability to feel anything at all. That's what people cut themselves and harm themselves, and I used to be there because at least that's a feeling, right? At least that reminds you that you're alive. And so even just not imagining like, I can't live another day. And so it was that kind of nothingness and despair that was propelling me. Like, I need to figure out what to live for. And when I was young, Christianity, it was everything but Christianity because I had judged religion by its hypocrites. I'm like, okay, there's all these bigots. I not so much an issue with whatever I knew then. It was very service level of the teachings of Jesus, but the people I saw around me. And I learned eventually that I didn't want to do it that way. I would test and try and judge the tenets of different religions and faith systems and philosophies and try them out in my own life and see if they got me anywhere closer to learning what it means to love from not having received the love I needed as a kid.
Yeah, and I'm wondering kind of about, like, kind of that question around, you know, seeing maybe what Jesus's teachings were and realizing that people were bigoted and seeing that, like, incongruence. I'm like,
Oh, yeah.
how did you know at the time, because you weren't, like, necessarily, like, following a faith or anything. So how did you know that those things were in aligning, or those things were, like, that they were hypocrites? Yeah.
Yeah, my dad was not part of our childhoods. He never knew our birthdays, that kind of thing. But he would spout things every now and then or give a bedtime story here or there whenever he got back from work, working as in a flooring company, in a small flooring company. And he would tell us, about like these parables of Jesus and things. But I could not square that with behavior of him and relatives and family members with hatred of the queer community. They're all going to hell, whatever, whatnot. I'm like, who are you to judge them? And like these kinds of things, right? So it was all of these little pieces I'd picked up in the background growing up. And my very first, well, now I'm Christian, right? This is just a faith tradition I follow. This is where I found the closest to the fullness of the truth that I think I could get to was the first a school board campaign I helped run in my county in Virginia. And I was at that point, and I was like, you know what? I've tried a lot. I've a few years out of undergrad, and I thought, yeah, I'll just give this Jesus guy a try. Oh, whatever. Let me find it out for myself, right? Let me
Okay.
not look at the people practicing it and find out. And so as an adult, I went ahead and Googled where to start. Reddit told me the Gospels, and I'm like, all right, nice. I'll start there.
Thank you, Reddit.
Like you read it. And the first time I wrote down Bible verses, it was without any Bible verse attribution. It was just me writing down quotes, just like I did from anyone before, from Lao Tzu to Eckert, right? And so I wrote down these, and by the time I reached the end of the Gospels, I was convinced that this was the truth. I believe
Oh,
that here at last is where I can learn how to love. And
wow.
it's been a very non-linear journey since then. A year later into this Christianity, and so many questions from my friend and her friends, and various pastors and priests and whatnot. But I personally got confirmed as a Catholic a year later with miracles and saints and the history of the church and sacraments or whatnot. But I specifically becoming Catholic with the Catholics I saw around me in the ultra conservative Arlington Diocese in the United States in Virginia. I thought I was the only progressive Catholic to ever exist, and I was going to heal the church and hold the hypocrites to account. So that's very Enneagram 8 for those who knows
Wow.
Enneagram.
Yeah.
It's very Enneagram attitude.
It's
But
like the
that's
Challenger,
kind of
right?
where I went.
Enneagram 8. Yeah.
Yes, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Wow. Wow. And I was like, wow, okay. And then, so in your mind also, you were reconciling being Catholic and also like your queer identity and being like, how
Oh
do
yeah.
I, like, is that possible? Can I do that? Is love
Oh
involved
my
with
gosh.
that? Like, like, so I guess it does kind of, can you speak to that as it relates to like your identity is influencing your healing?
Oh my gosh, yes. New Ways Ministry and Vine and Fig were two organizations I bumped up against. Like, I'm a queer Catholic. Does this exist? Like, there's no way. Conversion therapy is so debunked. It has traumatized, abused, and killed so many people. What's going on here? And I totally believe God made trans people exactly as they are. God made queer people exactly and beautifully as they are. I think the church has a long way to go on that. I support women's
Mm.
ordination as well. And I think a huge part of it is being faithful to the Spirit. Ultimately, church law teaches that you have to practice and do what your conscience tells you to do, because we believe the Spirit speaks through each of us. And so the institutional church, oh my gosh, there's a lot to say about that with the Catholic faith. But finding community with like-minded Catholics, with Pax Christi, the Catholic Peace and Justice movement, and with other places that of people who are seekers, seekers of the truth, right? We seek truth because
Mm.
we seek God, and we seek God because we seek the truth. Leads into that, but yeah, it's definitely been community for me there in regards to the intense transphobia and intense homophobia still rampant in the U.S. Catholic Church. These are
Mm.
systemic
Mm.
sins in my eyes.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. And so I'm curious, like, how have you held any like healing traditions around that, around holding this grief and like these clearly like systemic issues, right? How do you
Mm.
hold the systemic issues, and also how do you hold any practices around healing from systemic issues? I think there's a parallel, right, in both religious and spiritual spaces and faith spaces, and also in politics. And we're seeing it now in a lot of different ways, right?
Oh
But
yeah,
like,
right.
and maybe it's a big question, but I'm wondering just about like, yeah, what healing practices you have in seeing some of those injustices, maybe in both of those spaces.
Yeah, yeah. There solitude is not separation. I'll say for one thing. Thomas Merton writes beautifully about this in a New Seeds of Contemplation. But you seek solitude in order to learn from God how to love all people. That's what solitude should lead you to, and that includes loving yourself. There's also this great book, Let Yourself Be Loved, for people of faith that might be helpful by psychologist Philip Bennett that uses a God as a belief system in it. But I found that to be very formative for me. But individually, I like centering prayer. I love journaling. I love dream work, especially. In stages of initial formation, I've been really inspired to hopefully get to pursue psychology and Jungian psychology in general someday, become a psychologist. And dream work continues to be the most valuable tool that continues to help me befriend myself and stay an integrated person, or at least strive to be. And then
Oh.
I would say communally, we need community. You gotta find your people. You gotta find your community, you know? We're all born into our false selves, our external selves, our enneagrams, right? Enneagrams are essentially coping selves, whatnot. And there comes a point in life where you have to, that falls apart, where that part dies. You need to be able to step out of that. And there's grief in that too. And then comes a part where you learn your true gifts. And then comes a part where you learn how to share your true gifts to the world, right? This journey. But as you unmask, or as you find your true self, or you integrate yourself together, you're going to need new circles. You're going to need some new people. You're going to need to find some new ways of being. And so activism and finding these kindred souls has been a huge part of my healing too. And at the same time, not being dependent on the results of our work, but to do the good because it is good. There is this story I love about this man who did a one-person candle vigil outside the White House every day of the Vietnam War. And a reporter went up to this person and was like, hey, do you think your tiny little protest is going to change anything? And he said, no, but I'm doing this so that the world doesn't change me.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. And do you feel that? Do you feel like these practices, even like contemplative activism, which I'd love to hear how you define it. Do you feel like you do it so the world doesn't change you, so that you stay grounded in a way?
Exactly. So I stay true, right? The searching for truth, the seeking of truth, the seeking of God, the seeking of who you are, right? Sanctity is all about becoming exactly who you are, who you were really meant to be.
Ooh, can you say more?
Yeah. There is no soul that was ever born that was ever like you, and there will be no person to ever be born that's like you afterward. So your sanctity, your sainthood is to become exactly who you are and to find out who that is.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. That's really beautiful. It's like your search for truth, your search for love has sort of arrived in some ways at this now new pathway or question of like, who am I? Yeah. And like questioning like your own sanctity. Yeah. Right. Or your journey around that. Yeah. And part of that being the community organizing, part of that being like the practices that you have around centering prayer and all those things that keep you whole.
Because love does not tolerate indifference. I can't imagine being Christian without my activism.
Ooh, say more. Okay. I want to hear about that. Okay. Yeah. What is it? How would people even know that they're indifferent? Like versus, maybe some people feel like they're doing something, but like, how do they even know that they're like indifferent versus like actually being loving, passive versus active?
I think you really have to think about how radical it is to declare that every single person is totally equal in value. Every single person, regardless of where you were born, regardless of your socioeconomic status, regardless of your actions, every single person is totally equal in value. This is the kingdom, right? And you really have to question for yourself how do I treat each other, or how do I participate in systems if I really believe that? And so I think more important than the activism is the self awareness, and then also that dialogue with God, sitting with God in that, and sitting with yourself. If I really lived as if every person was totally equal in value, what would that mean? In my experience, I have discovered Christianity as the only major religion to really actually teach that, regardless of your karma, regardless of your status. So I think just meditating on that is a good starting point. But you have to care, right? You have to be alive enough to realize. You have to be alive enough to know. And it's often our own trauma from our childhoods that hold us back, that keep us masking, because we don't believe or don't have hope that there's a different way.
Yeah, and I want to continue to reiterate, like, so many people who see Christians who aren't necessarily Christians themselves. They see Christians in hypocrisy all the time, right? So when you're referring to Christianity, are you referring to like this religious system? Are you like, what are you referring to?
Oh, yeah. I think various institutions, especially big institutions that lived a long time, there's a lot to say about that, right? But I'm definitely talking about the faith tenets, I'd say, right? In triumphant religions, I think you can't really judge it by the existing systems or by the people around you. You have to take what the books say, what the books are teaching, right, and go from there and apply. Maybe that's a little abstract though, because I think it's both. You can try, you can meet people, you can do it out.
Yeah.
All of these things happen simultaneously for whatever
So
faith
it is
system
really
you
actually
prescribe
like
to,
taking a
right?
look at Jesus' teachings. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Starting at the beginning, right? Like what are the
Yeah.
fundamental things,
Yeah.
to love
Yeah. Got it.
every major religion, right? Don't do from the Talmud.
Yeah.
Do not do what is hateful
Yeah.
to others and what is hateful to you. Christianity, love one another as I have loved you. And certainly Islam has many sayings around this as well, right? Treat others how you want to be treated. This quote unquote golden rule that transcends all major religions. But what does that really mean lived out in practice? And are we willing to claim our responsibility? And I think loving each other and finding your specific way that you are called to love is how you find yourself.
I think that's really important what you said. Yeah, yeah, because obviously you're passionate about your pathway, right? And that might be different than other people's pathway, right? But
Oh
there is a
yeah, we got.
there, yeah, yeah. But there's a conviction there. There's a conviction there around like I am convicted by this particular pathway of like truth and love, and so. I really actually am curious about this conviction, especially around, maybe can you define for us first, like what is contemplative activism? And then what is your conviction around contemplative activism?
Yes, yes. I would describe contemplative activism as coming and returning to a place of solitude, inner solitude. It doesn't have to be physical solitude, but physical solitude definitely helps. Things like asceticism with discernment, not just asceticism for the sake of asceticism, right? But asceticism with discernment. These things all help you lead to cut out the noise and find out who you are. But I think you have to come from this place of self-knowledge and self-love and self-acceptance. Because you're not going to be perfect, and you've got to be able to accept and not suppress all of who you are. That leads you into this rhythm of going out into the world again. But you have to come back to yourself, or at least for me, right? The way that my spirituality, the way I participate, I identify as having a monastic heart, but there's many different spiritualities you can choose from, is to go out from a place of solitude, to remain in that place of inner solitude, in this inner dialogue with yourself and with God. Contemplation is secret. It is always a secret place that you dwell with yourself, that you dwell with God, and from that is this infinite well of love to pull from to go out into the world. And what is of God is not rushed, it's not hasty. You could even say that pride is the root of haste and rush, right? My timeline, whatnot, right? But when you are able to embrace yourself as a candle in a long, long line of many flames, right? To be part of a great cloud of witnesses, of sowing seeds even, right? Of doing the good because it is good before the truth. And I think that helps.
Well, I'm hearing this rhythm too as you're talking about it. I'm hearing this rhythm of like solitude, and then you're like but community, and then you're like solitude but community. Can you like speak to that? What are you talking about? Like if I were just like if I'm like don't have the background of like Jesus's teachings. If I'm just sort of like I'm like spiritual sometimes, like I'm hearing you. I'm hearing you, Jessica. I'm hearing like maybe having some self-awareness, having some self-love, like being actually intentional about search for truth. Like, what is this? You talk about solitude, you talk about community, like, what is this rhythm of solitude and then
Yes.
community?
I should clarify. I mean inner solitude. So not necessarily outer solitude, but an inner solitude. A place where you know yourself. a place inside where you can return to, right? We need community because as they say, when you put a bunch of rocks together, they rub up and smooth each other out. You need relationship, ongoing relationship with others to discover who you are. If you go and isolate yourself by yourself, you'll probably go mad. There's many philosophers who did that. But yeah, we need each other to learn about ourselves. We often see in each other, projections of what we have in ourselves, all that. And also, we were made, I think, to be with other people, to learn and grow with other folks. But yeah, I think community and solitude are not at all not at all contradictory in my head. It's this inner peace you find with yourself first, that I think lays the foundation for sustainable activism, or you find along the way as you keep trying. But that self-awareness and that conviction, right? That conviction of this is the truth and this is what's right, and I am committed to seeking that, no matter the consequences or of what that means, or I'm willing to try, right? Like Dan Berrigan has a great quote that says, I know that the prophetic vision is not popular today in some spiritual circles, but our task is not to be popular or to be seen as having an impact, but to speak the deepest truths that we know. So what is your deepest truth? And that's what you have to find out. That's solitude.
Wow. Yeah. And, it's interesting, like hearing the questions that you're asking now are different than maybe some of the questions you might have asked when you were experiencing that burnout on the road, and realize that burnout in activism on the road versus the like more sustainable activism now.
Right.
Yeah. And I wonder if you had that, do you feel like you had that practice when you experienced burnout earlier, or was that something that you learned along the way that was sort of missing?
Definitely learned along the way. Trial and error, right? You gotta throw yourself into the ring and find out, right? Like those various quotes that say, it's better to make a life of mistakes than a life doing nothing, right? There's a huge wellspring of life energy or soul force, or whatever you want to call it, inside each of us, right? That journey of self-actualization. There's a huge force in there. And some people get caught up in their false selves and living a life that's not them, right? And living a life that's not who they truly, deeply are. And you get lost in that. So to draw yourself out of that miasma and be like, this is worth losing what I thought my reputation was, or this is worth pivoting to a different career for, or, this is worth traveling somewhere I never thought I'd go or I didn't want to go, or that kind of thing, right? Like regardless of what people think about you, right? Like what do you really think about yourself? How do you really view yourself? And to live that life with integrity.
Wow.
No matter the external things.
Yeah. You're like, go out and try. Just go out and try things.
Leap.
Explore.
Leap, fall, do.
Yeah.
See what happens.
Yeah.
You might just find yourself.
Yeah. And so I am wondering, this is such a perfect segue to this question I have for you around, I asked you sort of like, how did your identity shape grief? How did they shape healing? And like in reverse, I'm curious, like how did grief and healing change you? How did it influence you and shape your identities? I know that you mentioned like even your sister and you have like such a different relationship now. And it's like one of the things you're most proud of. And how did that come to be? How did that healing journey, how did that grief exploration, how did it shape even your relationships?
It takes a lot of courage to be honest with yourself. It takes a lot of courage to leave behind what you knew. It takes a lot of courage to leave behind the path, right, of A, B, C, this, then that, right, and to fly into the unknown. But it is freedom. I think to love is to be free. And if you love somebody, you want them to be free. And you should want that for yourself too, right? And so this healing journey, this grief journey, my identities that have shaped me, they have given me the opportunity to find people who have similar identities, connect with them, listen to them, hear their stories, read their books, and find that I'm not alone. And James Baldwin says this so well, but he was like, this is what art and literature are for. There is some soul out there who's written something or who's painted something, who's created something, that speaks to the exact grief or difficult problem that you are trying to work through right now. Like there is someone out there who's there with you and is suffering in a very similar way. And the wounded healer, right? They're ready to heal you too. They want to heal you too. Join that journey. We're all wounded. Let's heal each other and heal ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that speaks to what you're saying about community. Like you have that experience in community when you're like healing together and healing wounds together. And I think I feel like we mentioned something earlier too, just about, I mean, I'm right now I'm reflecting on like just the creativity and art piece that you're talking about and how revolutionary that is. How art and creativity probably will be part of the revolution of like dismantling systems, because you need this creativity to be able to do it. And so, yeah, I mean, in some ways it sounds like grief and healing and how you have explored and tried things has allowed you to be even more creative, yes, and also more contemplative, and think about hold the two, like between art and creativity and activism and being contemplative as well.
Yes, we are all creative. We all have something that needs a creative outlet within us. Not everyone is going to be the greatest artist ever, right? Like, not at all. Maybe that's your calling. Absolutely, that could be your intersection of meaning, mastery, and money. It might be, but usually not for everybody. But there's something for you to create. Maybe for me, it's in the streets and organizing or whatnot, and the creative ways and nonviolence, civil disobedience, that kind of stuff, right? But, or maybe it's poetry, or maybe it's creating podcasts, maybe it's writing books, right? But we have all within us a creative force, something that creates and plays. So how do we enter that state of play? And that could be a whole nother topic too. But that's so important for everybody to cherish and love.
I think it's really important that you mention that, because I think sometimes when people think about activism, they're like, I'm not going to be in these streets. I'm not going to be like, I don't want to, some people are like, I want to like be in the streets. Some people are like, I'm too old to be in the streets, or like, I don't want to be out in the streets, but, I'm signing petitions, or, some people are like, is that the only way? I feel like is that enough? And it sounds like there's just so many different ways to be an activist.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think it's such a journey too, as you continue to seek and root yourself in your truth, and root yourself in your why, and also discover your why. Who are you? Why are you? What are you specifically called to do? I don't love quoting Steve Jobs, but I will say I appreciated that he talked about how somehow there seems to be within each person an answer already there about who you are and what you're meant to do, what your vocation is. It's already there. You just have to discover it. Right? So finding your why and what to do. And then also, as you journey along in activism and loving your neighbor, whatever that looks like for you, is discerning your risk level. Like, honestly, right? Like, where am I? Maybe I don't want to be out in the streets at all. Or maybe that's not safe for me for multiple reasons. And what else can I do? Usually there's no better starting point than just getting to know your local activists. Like, check out your local organizations. Like, what's going on near you? How can you plug in? Maybe you can send a postcard. Maybe you can do a phone call. Maybe you can join a peaceful, nonviolent protest with other folks who are committed to the practice of nonviolence, right? And learn more about nonviolence in general and nonviolent communication, even changing the way we speak, like emphasis points instead of bullet points. There are many, many different ways to contribute to promoting a peaceful world, a place that doesn't believe in violence, but open hearts. And so to be open to new experiences, be honest about your risk level, and start somewhere. But start. Go. Somewhere.
Yeah. And And so I'm glad you mentioned that, just because I'm sure there are people like who are listening who are just like, I don't have an idea of what to do, and it'd be great if an activist could just tell me. So thank you, Jessica, the activist who's like telling us different things we can do. That is so helpful. I want to like pull the thread of this like ethics and technology passion that you have as well, and sort of like coming back full circle to the beginning around like really sort of being nurtured into this identity at first of you have to do things to make money, and then kind of like seeing computer science as maybe an avenue or a way to do that. But then now, because of your various life experiences, being able to be like, wait a second, I can actually like do this for the good of other people and like serve people. I'm just curious, like can you tell us more about this intersection of ethics and technology, and sort of how it is part of this grief and healing path, maybe, and maybe even divergence from the value around having to make money and this is the way to do it?
Yes, right? Like, I love that more recently the idea of being morally ambitious is starting to come into the mainstream right now. Be morally ambitious, right?
Say more. What's that mean? What's that mean?
So Anand Giridharadas had an amazing commencement speech to his alma mater high school, Sidwell Friends, in 2023, I think. I think the manuscript is somewhere on his publication, The Ink. But I love what he says in there so well. Like, don't delude yourself that a fancy dinner date or like another high-rise apartment is worth continuing to destroy the planet, right? For other things, right? Or that this corporate law job is the same as advocating for human rights and our migrant neighbors, because it's not, right? So I think there's a lot to say about that as well. But there are amazing technologists, even if I'm hoping to one day pivot into the field of psychology myself, like the Distributed AI Research Institute, DAIR, does amazing work on AI ethics. Tech for Palestine is a wonderful like volunteer org that I think is doing fantastic stuff. There is also a whole hiring company for technologists that commits you to connecting with companies that will not support the military industrial complex. And I am struggling to remember the name of this company right off the top of my head, which is such a bummer. But there are more and more groups like that coming out, right? We're seeing unprecedented wealth concentration in the hands of the few, propelled by Silicon Valley or billionaires, right? We have people with purchasing powers of entire countries allowed to wealth hoard in this way. And this has been largely enabled by the rise of the tech industry in the way it has been without any meaningful regulation for so many years. So again, it really comes to the question of what is your why, and then also being educated on it. Some of my favorite news sources is Drop Site News and Lever News for more domestic focus. I'll put out those two as good sources to start, right? To act locally and think globally and be critical about who's funding the sources you're getting your news from.
Helpful. Thank you. And we'll put that as like some links too in our show notes as well that you mentioned. That's really helpful. Just this last question for you, like that I ask everyone, but I'm curious, like, what do you wish people knew about this topic, specifically around grief, healing, and identity as it related to politics and mental health and contemplative activism? What do you wish people knew? Or like, what do you wish you knew that you know now about this topic? What do you wish your 12-year-old self knew about your current self?
Well, I'll start with politics. And this is a quote by good old Merton. And when he was writing to a despairing friend that's been very close to me this past year, since the Trump administration especially, and he says this: do not depend upon the results of your work. You may have to face the fact that your work will seem worthless and achieve no results at all. If not, perhaps results the opposite of what you expect. As you get used to this idea, you will start more and more to concentrate not on the results, but on the value, the rightness, the truth of the work itself. You will gradually struggle less and less for an idea and more for specific people. In the end, it is the reality of personal relationship that saves everything. I spent right. I spent so many of my early activist years being caught up in the ideas, these big far-fetched ideas of campaign finance reform or the patriarchy or the global military-industrial complex, and I found myself burnt out over and over and over again. It wasn't until I really started building relationships with other activists, and most importantly, my relationship with myself, that I found a sustainable place to keep going to, a sustainable reminder, and my specific part in the bigger system of the marathon and not the sprint that all of this is. And my message to my 12-year-old self, who was desperately seeking and searching for a life worth living for, what I discovered more recently in the past few years, on my first silent retreat, about 3 days in with an amazing spiritual director, was that my life was actually always worth living. Always. Simply because God loved me into existence. Or I was loved into existence. Whatever you prescribe to, I believed you were loved into existence. But that there was no system I needed to build. There was no complex I needed to dismantle. There was no organization I needed to start to make my life worth living. It always was. I believe and I feel and I experience that there's a love that always holds me and has known me, knows me more than I knew myself, has known me before I knew myself. And that's what I would want my 12-year-old self to know. You don't have to try so hard. You can just be.
Ooh. Just giving me, like, I was like, ooh, you're speaking to more than your 12-year-old self. For sure.
That's right. Whoa. Yes. Yes. Yeah. All our inner children that we carry around with us. Those precious, precious people.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you so much for just sharing your wisdom and your wealth of knowledge and all of the reading and quotations and experience and you just have you're a wealth of knowledge and care, and just really it flows out through you. So I hope you know that. I hope that you know that I'm just really grateful for everything that you're sharing. And as we wrap up, I'm wondering if our listeners want to connect with you. Is that okay with you first? If they do that.
Absolutely. And Dana, thank you. Thank you for your leadership, your creative spirit, your vision, and your hope, and your willingness to create this space and be who you are authentically, and to heal so many others, and to heal the world. You are an inspiration. So thank you. But yes, I would be happy to connect with folks.
I received that, and thank you. Yeah, so the best way I think you mentioned for people to connect with you, LinkedIn, is that right?
Yes. Yeah, we got LinkedIn, okay. Jessica's not on there, feel free, happy to connect. Upscrolled, which is a more ethical alternative to Instagram, all right? Find me on Upscrolled, Jessica Sun, and then there's Spoutable, the more ethical derivative for Twitter, okay? Spoutable, Upscrolled, LinkedIn. Hit me up. Jessica's not on all of them.
Awesome. I love it. Thank you, Jessica, for your time. Appreciate you.
Dana, you are a light. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Untethered to Rooted. Untethered to Rooted is produced and hosted by me, Dana Daugherty. Original music was composed and performed by the ever-talented Daniel Dickinson. Thanks so much to our guests for sharing with us today. And if you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, and review our podcast. And follow us on social at Untethered to Rooted. And if you didn't like it, what podcast? Dana who? Until next time, take and give good care.